Hello, I have two books to talk about this week, and both of them just happen to be blue, but that's not the interesting thing about these books. What I found fascinating about the two books that I happened to read this week is that this one is actually one of the books that's been on my TBR the longest, and the other one is a book that is one of my most anticipated reads of the year. I'm going to start by talking about the things we lost to the water, or just things we lost to the water. This book was published in 2021 and I would say is a work of contemporary fiction. It kind of felt like it was just a general fiction category to me. And it is about a Vietnamese family that ends up leaving Vietnam in 1978 and very unexpectedly moving to New Orleans, Louisiana to restart their life. And this was a really fascinating story because it follows the lives of the three members of the family, including the mom, who is trying to figure out why her husband did not come with her, as well as trying to figure out how to manage life in a new country as a single mom where she doesn't know or speak the language. She also has two sons that comes with her. One of them, I think, was 5 at the time they leave, and so he has memories of life in Vietnam and of his father, and yet has to deal with those as he also tries to learn the language and find his own place in New Orleans and his new life in America. And then finally, you have a second son who was actually born as they were traveling to New Orleans. And so his only experience of growing up is in the US as an American citizen. So you end up getting to see an immigration experience of a Vietnamese family moving to New Orleans during a very particular time period. It covers the years, I think, 1978 to 2005, and just the various ways that they deal and cope with the immigration experience and feeling like outsiders in a city that may or may not be welcoming to them. This book covers a variety of different topics, including family. It, like I said, almost feels like a multi-generational family story. And it also talks about the immigrant experience in general. I've read a couple of books now about the people immigrating to different places in the world, and I thought this one was particularly interesting. And then it also subtly looks at like the choices we make in life, why we make them, how they affect us and those around us, especially others in our family. And I had some high hopes for this book. I bought it quite a while ago. I mentioned it's one of the oldest books that I own that I haven't read. And I'm realizing that I bought it at the time largely because I saw somebody else say they really enjoyed this book and so thought that meant that I would like it. I have since learned that that's not how reading works. I don't know why it took me a few years to understand that. I still fall into that trap sometimes. But you know how it is. So I found that there were a lot of good parts to this book that I did, in fact, enjoy. I thought it did a really good job of sharing what it was like to be Vietnamese living in New Orleans at that time. I felt like it was a story that focused more on the immigrant experience than life in New Orleans itself. I thought it was set in a different part of New Orleans that I feel like we don't always hear about. It wasn't very heavy in sort of using the setting of New Orleans as a huge like trope with Mardi Gras and like all those types of things. It was less about the city and really more about the family and the immigrant experience. And I thought that was handled very well throughout the book, especially looking at the differences the experience would be for each generation of this family. And for me, that was probably one of the strongest parts of the book and the parts of the book that I liked the most. I also thought it was really interesting to learn about the Vietnamese community in New Orleans and how it was set up during this time period and a little bit about why. I don't think it went very deeply into why the Vietnamese community was where it was or why it was set up the way it was. I think a lot of that was kind of implied or just glossed over, but that was okay. I still feel like it piqued my interest and gave me enough explanation that I didn't feel lost. I did, however, find the pacing in some parts of the book a bit slow and sometimes predictably slow. I felt like there were certain things that happened that was like, oh, now you're going to slow down the pace and drag this out. You know, in the like, you know, a person's trying to tell a story while another person's lying in bed and the other person predictably falls asleep. So you did have a couple of moments like that. And I think that made some parts in the middle of the book kind of drag in a way that I didn't quite enjoy. I also wish in this case that because we got multiple points of view, that the points of view had been shared a little bit more equally, because I felt like at one point in the book, one of the points of views dropped off quite a bit. And it was a point of view that I still wanted to hear more about that character. But for the vast majority of the rest of the book, we really only got what was going on with that character through the other two points of view, where I would have preferred if we still continued to get their point of view regularly. That said, this book ended up being okay for me. I ended up giving it, I think, 3.5 stars. I was hoping that it would be at least a 4-star read for me, given how long I've held on to this book before finally reading it. But at the same time, I think that's why it sat on my shelf for so long, because the further I got removed from the time I purchased this, the more I realized this probably wasn't going to be a book that I absolutely loved. That does not mean, however, that you might not like this book. I would recommend this book to anyone who likes books about immigrant experiences or people just trying to adapt to new and different situations, who are particularly interested in refugee experiences or Vietnamese communities or just different communities living in and around New Orleans. If you caught it, the book does cover the time frame of 1978 to 2005, so you do get a little bit into Hurricane Katrina, but I also appreciated that that was not the point of this book. I feel like a lot of books set in New Orleans nowadays only have to do with Hurricane Katrina. And I understand that to some extent, but I feel like that's not all that there is to the city. And so I do appreciate that this book focused on another aspect of it, even though it was still set there in New Orleans. I also think this would be a really enjoyable book for anybody who liked character studies, because you do spend a lot of time with these very different family members, kind of exploring how they are coping with the different scenarios that they're set into. And I think it does a really good job of that. So if that's something you like, I think you might enjoy this book. That said, I usually try and also recommend things that you might want to read if you liked this book and want to read something else like that. And the only one that I could come up with is Archives of Unknown Universes. I think that's the order of the words. I'll put a picture of the book up on the screen and the title in the description box below. But that is a really good book that also looks at immigrant experience. And I swear there's one other one that I've read recently as well, but I can't think of it. If I do, I'll put that up on the screen as well. But those are books that I think don't necessarily read like this one, but deal with very similar topics, but in other communities. And so might also be books that you enjoy, or if you enjoyed those books, you might want to give that one a try. All right, so on to the next book that I read. I was really excited when I was able to get this on my TBR for the month and that I got the time to read it. And this is The Road to Roswell by Connie Willis. I have read two works by Connie Willis before, and both of them I really enjoyed. One of them is To Say Nothing of the Dog. That was her first work that I read. I thought it was absolutely hilarious and loved that book. I then followed it up by reading the first book in the series. They're in the same universe, so you don't necessarily need to read them in the correct order, and I didn't. But I read the first book in that series, which is the Doomsday Book, I believe is what it's called, and that was a really good book and was really sad and emotionally moved me in a completely different direction. And so I was really looking forward to getting back into Connie Willis. I was expecting this book to be a fun, lighthearted read, and for the most part, I did experience it as such. So what is this book about? This book is about a young woman named Francie, who is going to New Mexico to attend her best friend's wedding. Or not just her best friend, but her best friend from college, her roommate's wedding. And they were roommates that couldn't be more opposite. Francie was always the level-headed, get you out of trouble kind of roommate. And her roommate was always the fly by the seat of her pants, falling in love with all the wrong, weird people. And she is living up to that reputation in this book because Francie is going to save her friend from possibly marrying the UFO conspiracy theorist boyfriend she's been dating. And to do that, she needs to go as the bridesmaid to potentially attend their UFO themed wedding. Francie is very skeptical about all of this, from the wedding to the setting to the bridegroom himself. But lo and behold, as Francie makes her way there, she ends up getting abducted by an alien. And the story just goes on from there. It is a high flying, really random, silly at times, uh, sci-fi adventure. It is definitely soft sci-fi where you're not getting too deep into mechanisms, this, that, or the other thing. A lot of the whole situation surrounding the alien in the book remains a mystery for the vast majority of it. And as they adventure around, she realizes she's either needing to be rescued from the alien or is trying to help rescue the alien or someone else. It's definitely a book that is heavily based on the trope of miscommunication, and a little bit of found family, because as they go around, they end up abducting a few more people. So you end up with a zany cast of characters who have all come together and are all have different motivations as to whether or not they're trying to help Francie and her little alien pal. And it is a really interesting ride, literally, because you're just riding around with them. And I enjoyed it for the most part. There are a lot of good things that come up in this book. I think there is a lot of discussion in here about sort of not judging a book by its cover, realizing that not everything that you think or hear is exactly what it appears to be at first blush, and that, miscommunication can occur if we don't, if we choose not to listen to what other people are saying or take them seriously just because, we have decided that, you know, we've judged them basically, before getting to know them. So I did like that as sort of an underlying subtle theme throughout the book, and I did think it was funny. It was really nice and lighthearted. However, it was also kind of slow paced. I felt like this book really needed to be more novella length, because I think that would have helped from having the miscommunication trope turn up over and over again. That kind of was really the only thing that was driving the plot forward. To keep the book rather lighthearted, there weren't very high stakes, even though there was supposed to be a bit of this tension of being chased. That didn't work so well, though, because for the vast majority of the book, there's no reason to truly feel like they're being chased, and there's no evidence that they are being chased. And so there's a lot of just random driving around from scene to scene. It kind of reminded me of the feeling I got when reading Eye of the World, where I felt like it was just the same sort of setup over and over again, where it was like, run, arrive in a location, do silly things there. I mean, silly in this case, in Eye of the World, it was like, try to survive. Um, and then suddenly you have to leave that area and run to the next area, and you just repeat this, sort of chase scene loop over and over again. That happened in this book. It didn't bother me as much as it did in Eye of the World. But again, I was really not liking the miscommunication in here. That's probably a personal preference. I know some people don't mind that, but for me, I think if you're going to have somebody trying to communicate something in a book and they try one time and fail, I really don't want them to try and fail more than one or two more times. In here, I felt like it started to happen in every single chapter, and I got to the point where I was just frustrated, and I was like, you could just end the book. Like, just let them say what they need to say and let the book end. But instead, we needed it to be thicker or something, so it kept going on. I don't know. It irritated the crap out of me, if you can't tell. Despite the fact that I did find this book to be fun and kind of rom-com almost in its feeling, I did also find that I didn't really like the potentially budding romance that was going on. It didn't feel realistic to me, or realistic enough or believable, and I didn't feel totally bought into it in some ways. I felt like it was a smidge too insta-love for me, and that led to the ending of this book not only feeling abrupt for completely other reasons, but also feeling just sort of unbelievable. And I didn't need this to be like a book of realism, but I needed it to convince me of the storyline that it was trying to sell. And at the end, there were parts that I weren't convinced were really going to go on, even in this world with these characters, which is a shame. So I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I'm pretty bummed by that. I was really hoping it would be 4 and 4.5. I thought there was a chance it could even be a 5-star read for me, honestly, if it was just fun. And it was fun. It was lighthearted. But again, I just have a couple of what feel like personal pet peeves that I don't like, I would say give this book a try. If you like, fun, lighthearted books, this is definitely that. If you like something that's a bit adventurous and, pretty heavily plot based with, some light characterization in there, this would work well. And especially if you like something that feels a little like a rom-com but isn't too heavy on the romance, this would also be pretty satisfying for those things. I think if you wanted to read a book that has a similar feel but I think is done way better, I would say read To Say Nothing of the Dog by Connie Willis. I think it has a lot of the same tropes and setups as this book, but I feel like there was a lot more time spent on the execution in To Say Nothing of the Dog. Another book that this kind of reminded me of, just in terms of the lightheartedness and silliness and the cast of characters, would be the Kaiju Preservation Society. I don't know that I would say that I thought that book was better than this book. I feel like for me, they were probably around the same. But if you read that book and you liked it, you might want to give this book a try. I feel like this book gets a lot less discussion on BookTube, at least from what I can see. But I think this would have wide appeal to a lot of people. It just didn't totally do it for me. And some of that, honestly, may even be because I've read other works by Connie Willis and thought they were better than that. So I don't know what to make of that, but that's how it worked out. So those are the two books that I finished this week. I have been reading some other books, and like the Arabian Nights and a short story collection I'm working on for a in-person book club, and I've got some buddy reads going on, but I will talk about all of those when I finish them, or at least get to a point that makes sense to wrap up some information about them. Let me know if you've read either of these two books, what you thought of them, if you liked them more than I did, that kind of thing, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!